welcome to the 13th Annual Kosciuszko Chair Spring Symposium. This year's virtual conference will focus on the topic of crisis in the Intermarium, war in Ukraine and its implications. Today's joint virtual symposium is organized by the Institute of World Politics and is in honor of Lady Blanka Rosenstiel. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs. We offer a doctoral program, 7 master's degree programs, including 2 online MAs, and 18 certificates of graduate study. If you're interested in learning more about us, please visit iwp.edu. On behalf of IWP, I'd like to thank all our supporters who make these events possible. Today we will hear from Lieutenant Colonel W.T. Russell, who will give a lecture on his book, And Our Hearts to Poland, a novel of the triumph and tragedy of America's oldest and most loyal ally. Lieutenant Colonel Russell's love of Polish history began when he married Katarzyna, the daughter of a regional leader in the Polish Solidarity movement of the 1980s and granddaughter of a survivor of Stalin's Gulags. He is a retired US Army Infantry Officer and a veteran of the Cold War, Desert Storm, the Balkan peacekeeping operations, and the Iraq War. He and his wife were in the Pentagon on 9/11. He holds Bachelor of Arts in Russian Studies, an Executive Master of Arts in National Security Affairs from IWP, and a Juris Doctor from Florida A&M College of Law. Please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Russell.
I'm very honored to address the Kosciuszko Chair Symposium and present my new historical novel, And Our Hearts to Poland, telling the story of Poland's contributions to the Allied victory in World War II, as well as its betrayal at the negotiating tables of the Big Three powers at Tehran and Yalta. On the morning of May 18, 1944, a trumpeter of the Polish Second Corps blew the Hey Now as the white over red colors of Poland were raised over the ruins of the abbey on the Peak of Monte Cassino, Italy. It signaled an Allied victory, clearing the advance to Rome in the longest and costliest battle of the Allied campaigns on the Western Front during World War II. It was also the harbinger of the betrayal of America's oldest and most loyal ally to Stalin, who was Hitler's ally in their joint invasion and subjugation of Poland in 1939 until they turned on each other in June of 1941. Along with its triumphs, the book highlights the tragedy of Poland's betrayal, resulting in the forfeiture of half of Poland's pre-war territory to the Soviet Union and its subjugation to Soviet communist rule for 45 years. In unfolding the story of Poland's plight, the novel explores the history of Polish Second Corps and their journey from their arrest and exile by the Soviets from their native Poland to the Gulags of Siberia, and from their release and travels across Central Asia and the Middle East to the battlefields of Italy. Along the way, the main character, Stanisław Chaya, introduces some of the greatest real-life heroes of the war who were erased by years of Soviet oppression and propaganda, and points the reader to the growing treasures of overlooked historical accounts. Stan also shares the heartrending despair and ultimate betrayal of the soldiers of the Polish Second Corps at the negotiating table of the Big Three powers at Tehran and Yalta, which were ultimately cemented at Potsdam. In writing the novel, I have endeavored to be as historically accurate as possible while telling the story of the Second Corps and of Poland's contributions to the Allied victory, and in exploring some controversial subjects impacting Polish-American and Polish-Jewish relations. These subjects include more than 80 years of Nazi wartime and Soviet post-war propaganda accusing the Poles and the Catholic Church not only of anti-Semitism, but of active participation in the Holocaust. This is despite the fact that more than 7,200 Poles have been recognized as righteous among nations by the Yad Vashem for helping to protect and shelter Jews during the Holocaust. Stan tells the story of a few of those whom the Soviets sought to erase from history. In doing so, he defends the honor of Poland and the Church. As an author, I have endeavored to present this in the historical novel format in an even-handed manner of someone who is a friend of both Poland and a friend of Israel. It is not intended in any way to deny the Holocaust nor those who suffered during it. Rather, it is to acknowledge the totality of the suffering caused by 2 megalomaniacal dictators justifying their crimes using their variations of the socialist ideologies of Nazism and communism. Beginning with the description of Poland as America's oldest and most loyal ally, this is best demonstrated by the namesake of this symposium, Tadeusz Kosciuszko. Kosciuszko was a hero of both the American War of Independence and Poland's struggle to reassert its own independence from the Russian, Prussian, and Austrian empires. Kosciuszko's inspiration to the Polish people to aspire to governance under the founding principles, first adopted in the United States, established a bond between the Polish and American peoples, grounded in the thirst for freedom and independence. Kosciuszko arrived in America in June of 1776. After a French-language interview with Benjamin Franklin, he was hired to design and build a defense for Philadelphia to protect it from the British Navy. Upon its completion, the Continental Congress appointed him as a colonel of engineers. In 1777, Kosciuszko's defenses along the Hudson led to the surrender of General Burgoyne's corps at Saratoga on October 17th of 1777, and this surrender of a major British command is regarded by many as the turning point of the war. In 1778, General Washington commissioned Kosciuszko to build the defenses of the Hudson River at West Point to prevent the British from sailing up the Hudson and dividing the colonies. Portions of the defenses and a monument to him still stand today. Later in the war, as the chief engineer of the Southern armies in the Carolinas, Kosciuszko directed river crossings, saving the American forces from British advances on 2 occasions. He was wounded in an attack to take a British fort in South Carolina and served as a field commander during the siege of Charleston. At the war's end, Kosciuszko was gifted a sword and 2 pistols by George Washington. He was also awarded American citizenship and promotion to brigadier general and a 500-acre land grant in Ohio. There were many political developments and intrigues in Poland during Kosciuszko's early years, which were disturbing to the young officer and disastrous for Poland. King Stanislav II ceded large portions of Polish territory to Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And while Kosciuszko was studying in France, this partition was approved by the Polish Sejm, or Parliament, in 1772. After his time in America and greatly inspired by the Declaration of Independence, Kosciuszko returned to Poland in 1784, hoping it could become a model for the reemergence of an independent Poland. However, he could not secure an appointment in the Polish army due to his opposition to the king's partition of Poland until liberal political reforms were introduced supporting independence in 1789. Russia invaded Poland in 1792 in an attempt to end the Polish independence movement. Kosciuszko rose to fame in Poland for his actions during the Battle of Blanka on July 18, 1792, where his division prevented the crossing of the Bug River by a Russian force 5 times as large, forcing the Russians to cross the river south of the Polish-Austrian border. Later in 1792, the king abandoned the move towards independence, resulting in the second partition of Poland, which further reduced Polish territory in 1793. On March 24, 1794, Kosciuszko returned to Krakow. In front of a large crowd, he swore an oath to a constitution of the First Polish Republic, which was modeled after the new United States Constitution. He assumed political and military leadership of the Polish independent movement. On April 4, 1774, the Polish peasant army under Kosciuszko's command defeated the Russians in the Battle of Rasławicz, killing over 1,000 and capturing 12 cannons. However, unlike the American colonies, Poland did not have the expanse of oceans and continents to separate it from the greater powers seeking to dominate it. The armies of Russia, Prussia, and Austria could march to Warsaw. Follow-on counterattacks from the Russian and Prussian forces forced Kosciuszko into a defense of Warsaw, where his military engineering skills and inspiration of the Polish people held the combined Prussian and Russian armies at bay for over 2 months. He instigated an uprising in the rear of the besieging Prussian army, forcing their withdrawal from Warsaw. However, he was unable to reconsolidate his forces for the Battle of Machajowice on October 10, 1794, and after his forces ran out of ammunition, the Poles were defeated. Having 3 horses shot from under him during the battle, Kosciuszko was also wounded twice, and he was captured. He was imprisoned in St. Petersburg, Russia, and the Polish uprising collapsed, and Poland was erased from the map, with a third partition incorporating the remainder of Poland into Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And Poland remained partitioned until November the 11th of 1918, when the Second Polish Republic was established by the Treaty of Versailles. Following the death of Catherine the Great, her son granted Kosciuszko his freedom in 1796. He returned to the United States, where he received a hero's welcome and cultivated a lasting friendship with Thomas Jefferson. Before leaving the U.S. to return to France to champion the Polish cause in 1798, he apportioned his American estate to the freedom and education of black slaves. In France, Kosciuszko refused Napoleon's offer to place him in command of Polish troops under the French flag unless the emperor's plans included liberation of Poland. Kosciuszko remained in exile from his native Poland until his death in Switzerland in 1817. He was entombed in Wawel Castle in Krakow alongside the Polish kings a year later. Of course, Polish troops have fought alongside U.S. troops in World War II and more recently in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as in support of peacekeeping operations in the Balkans. In finding an understanding of Poland's contributions and of the level of betrayal it experienced during World War II, we have to understand how little most of us know about Poland. The lead supporting character of the novel, Brad, reflects my own awakening to the richness of Poland's contributions to the Allied victory in World War II. In all my previous studies of the Second World War and European history, Poland was always pushed to the periphery and treated as a minor player. It was just the unlucky land and people that always seemed to get overrun by greater European powers. The playground dominated by Germany and Russia. And while all my previous studies recognize that World War II began with the German and Russian invasions of Poland in 1939, Poland was always just a country whose territory other countries fought over. Its hardships and sufferings, along with its accomplishments and contributions to the Allied victory, were rarely, if ever, mentioned. My own eyes were opened by reading A Question of Honor, Olson and Cloud's book on the history of Squadron 303 and its phenomenal accomplishments as the highest scoring squadron in the Royal Air Force during its operations in the Battle of Britain. The Polish squadron comprised only 10% of the RAF fighter force, yet scored 40% of the kills against the German Luftwaffe during the heights of the Blitz. And the shock of this awakening is reflected in this passage. The book was a surprise and a shock to Brad. He prided himself on his historical knowledge, especially his familiarity with World War II, the former Soviet Union, and the Warsaw Pact. His undergraduate degree was in Russian studies. He believed himself reasonably knowledgeable, but this book had opened his eyes to an overlooked part of history which he had not seen nor heard before. It was a part of history which had been buried under more than 6 decades of obscuration and broad-brush historical analysis. What little he knew of Poland was a fabrication of many years of Nazi wartime and Soviet post-war propaganda. In addition to the exploits of the Polish squadrons of the RAF, this book also provides some details of other Polish contributions and oriented me to the depths of the tragedy and betrayal which Poland suffered during the war. Olson and Cloud's book concluded a description of the Polish Second Corps and their odyssey from their deportations to the Siberian Gulags and their trek across Iran, Iraq, modern-day Israel, to the victory on the mountaintop at Monte Cassino. It also lays out the political anatomy of Poland's betrayal in the negotiations between Stalin, President Roosevelt, and Churchill at Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. This betrayal resulted in the forfeiture of the eastern half of Poland's pre-war territory and Soviet domination of Poland for 45 years. What really brought home the tragedy of Poland's plight during the war was on page 374, noting the suicides of over 30 soldiers from the Second Corps in the week immediately following the announcement of the Yalta Agreement in February of 1945. In the novel, Brad's shock at learning this history reflects my own shock and is presented in the context of my own attendance to weekly briefings to the Secretary of the Army during my last tour at the Pentagon. In those briefings, suicides in the U.S. Army are tracked. On the completion of the briefing, Brad turned to Colonel Alvarez and asked, "Hey, sir, when we look at 126 suicides across a population of 1 million soldiers over the course of a year, can you imagine a unit with a strength of 40,000 to have over 30 suicides in 1 week?" Colonel Alvarez responded, "Christ, where did that happen?" Brad replied, "Polish Second Corps in World War II, not long after they took the mountaintop at Monte Cassino in the Battle of Ancona. I did some math. Their suicide rate during this period was over 300 times our own rate." And as I learned that, all I could wonder was how to figure out what drove such a horrendous level of despair. Adding insult to the injury of their tragedy, the exiled soldiers and airmen of Poland, who spent the entire war fighting to free their homeland only to see it subjugated to Stalin, were excluded from the victory parade in London because they refused to swear allegiance and submit to the Soviet-installed communist government of Poland. And so began my own journey of trying to understand how this tragic scenario for Poland came to be played out. One of the keys to the Soviet success in undercutting Poland with the Allied powers, particularly the United States and the UK, was Soviet political messaging and how Poland was perceived in the West. It has long been understood that information and propaganda play a huge role in shaping public perceptions, which in turn impact the political will of a people to lend their lives and treasure to military and political ends, especially during war. I saw this growing up with the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War in the late 60s and 70s. With the anti-war protests and the characterization of all American actions in Vietnam as just another extension of the My Lai massacre. And this permeated not only the press but also popular media. I also witnessed this during my own military career during the Iraq War, with the negative impacts of the left-leaning political message breathlessly repeating the false charges of cold-blooded murder against the Haditha Marines. The very same messengers would have you believe that all Iraqi POWs were waterboarded or habitually mistreated, as we saw in the endless television broadcast of the pictures from Abu Ghraib. Meanwhile, the initial endless stream of beheading videos, tortures, and murders committed by the terrorists and produced and put on the web in the name of Islam were scrubbed and hidden from easy access on the internet and given very little coverage. And we see this played out in the themes against Poland. Number one was that the Poles were too backward and incompetent to rule themselves, as promoted by the continuous propaganda picture of Polish cavalry charging tanks with swords and lances, or the streams of the idea that Polish anti-Semitism is deep-seated historical hatred leading to spontaneous murder of Jews, particularly in the portrayals of the Yavabne and Kielce incidents. That Poles were active and willing participants in the Holocaust, again promoted by initially by the Nazis and turned by the Soviets in the post-war era repeatedly, and to justify that Soviet control of Poland was necessary to serve as a bulwark to protect the Jewish Holocaust survivors from the Poles. And finally, the idea that Polish anti-Semitism is rooted in an extension of Catholicism. These are some of the techniques applied by the Soviets in promoting the propaganda themes against Poland throughout the war, in the post-war period, and which continue today. And we see some of these same techniques turned against Israel in the pro-Hamas protests currently on college campuses across the country. And some of these techniques include creating and amplifying perceived instances of Polish discrimination against the Jews. There were many examples of this in the US Army, as well as in the current portrayals of Yavabne and the Kielce incidents. The Soviets also sought to denounce and bury any reports or discussion of Jewish support for the Soviets or involvement with the NKVD, as with charges of anti-Semitism. And this is a turn on the cliche and the anti-Semitic charge of using the cliche of the communist Jew. Keep the spotlight on the Holocaust to hide Soviet atrocities against Poland. Bury stories of centuries of peaceful coexistence between Poles and Jews. Bury stories of Polish protection of Jews. And encourage like-minded fellow travelers in politics, media, and entertainment to promote communist themes in the West. And repeat the same lies over and over and over again. And we can see how this applies in the following atrocities, which are covered in my book. And many of you have not heard of these, 4 of the 5 of these atrocities. Everyone is familiar with the Holocaust. There is no question that over 13 million people were killed in the Nazi concentration camps. This includes over 6 million Jews, and the first goal of Hitler's final solution was the extermination of the Jews as a race. It was industrialized murder on a grand scale, from the roundups to the spontaneous mass executions, to the transports, to the gas chambers, to the ovens. Unfortunately, it was not the only atrocity of the era in the region. The Holodomor occurred next door to Poland in the Ukraine. It was Stalin's intentional starvation of over 8 million Ukrainians, or about 25% of the Ukrainian population, in 1932 to 1933. Now, when I studied this as an undergraduate, it was always portrayed as the overzealous implementation of the Soviet collectivization of farms. When it was happening, the New York Times and its foreign correspondent in Moscow, Walter Duranty, denied any famine existed. The Katyn massacre was Stalin's intentional execution of not only the Polish officer corps, but the entirety of the political, judicial, administrative, and local leaders from eastern Poland. The NKVD murdered over 26,000 people in the Katyn Forest near Smolensk, Russia, in April and May of 1940. The site was discovered by the Germans in 1942 after their invasion of Russia and exhumed and publicized in 1943. When the Polish government in exile protested the execution, Stalin used the excuse to break relations with the exiled Polish government and appoint his own communist government in Poland on the grounds the Poles were promoting Nazi propaganda. As Germany turned on Russia in June 1941, the Russians found themselves in full retreat. Rather than transport or release prisoners they had in the local jails, the NKVD summarily executed many of the prisoners before fleeing. They did this throughout eastern Poland. The Volhynia Massacre was a communist-inspired ethnic Ukrainian pogrom against the Poles in the Volhynia region of eastern Poland. Hundreds of thousands were brutally murdered by groups inspired and instigated by the Ukrainian leader Bandera. But we have to look at how this and the preceding atrocities have been portrayed and their impact on the public perception of Poland in the United States. Media is usually a good example. This short scene from the movie Schindler's List, as the train transporting Jews approaches the gates of Auschwitz, reinforces the idea that all Poles were complicit in the Holocaust. This also plays out in the promotion of books painting the willing participation of Poles in the spontaneous murder of their Jewish neighbors. I remember the glowing multi-page review that Jan Gross's book received in the Washington Post in 2005-2006. Of course, Gross is a sociologist, not a historian, and his primary source for the book was the transcript from the post-war Soviet show trials of the town's mayor and other leaders. There is no indication he made any use of the German archives pointing to the existence of a Nazi program to implicate local populations in the extermination of Jews carried out by the Nazi Einsatzgruppen. Emotionally, it is more difficult to address some descendants of Holocaust survivors like pundit Debbie Schlussel, who blames the Poles for being complicit in the Holocaust. Her grandparents were the remaining few survivors of each of their own large families, which was all too common an experience of Jewish families during the Holocaust. Ms. Schlussel is adamant that it was Poles who were responsible for the murder of her grandparents' families. Although she is a political conservative, the descriptions she provides from the family lore in blaming the Poles for their deaths bear all the hallmarks of both the Nazi and the communist programs of exploitation of the peoples of eastern half of Poland, in which the Nationalist Socialists from Germany sought to implicate the Poles, and the Proletarian Socialists from Russia sought to implicate the Jews in their genocidal crimes. It must also be noted that the Soviets turned and played the Nazi propaganda against the Poles by accusing the Poles of Nazi collaboration during the Holocaust. Needless to say, Ms. Schlussel's family case deserves a deeper examination beyond the scope of this presentation. There is a vast body of knowledge that records Poland's contributions to the war effort and highlights the Soviet and Nazi propaganda programs to drive infectious wedges between the ethnic groups of the Kreshe and the Pale of Settlement to exploit the ethnic divides and cover up and shift blame for their own crimes to those groups. The books on the left by Melchior Vankovich, General Anders, Leon Velichker-Wells, and Churchill are primary source eyewitness accounts of the Polish contributions and the unfolding of Poland's plight in the war. Unfortunately, the Vankovich book is only available in Polish, but is due for an English language publication this coming August. The Anders, Wells, and Davies books provide repeated examples of how the NKVD manipulated the situation and promoted the perception of Polish anti-Semitism. The Wells book, The Janowska Road, is particularly interesting. Wells was a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust who testified at the Nuremberg trials. He was forced to burn the bodies and grind the bones of his fellow Jews to cover up the Nazi crimes while he was in the camps. However, his descriptions of the Soviet occupations in eastern Poland highlight how he and his family were prime examples of how the NKVD implicated the Jewish communities as perpetrators of Soviet rule, with privileged positions for running Soviet stores, selection for university education in Moscow, and his own open ties to the NKVD. Professor Hodakevich's book, The Masquerade Vobne, is a much more detailed account and is a direct counter to Gross's book Neighbors, and is the key to understanding the Nazi program to implicate the Poles in the Nazi perpetration of the Holocaust, as well as the crimes at Yavovna. Unfortunately, most of these books never get read. Propaganda messaging against Poland has been extended to the Catholic Church. This is in part because many Poles view Catholicism as an integral part of being Polish, as Professor Hodakiewicz points out in his book on Spanish Carlism and Polish nationalism. The fundamental Catholic principles that the inherent worth of the individual and that his or her inalienable rights spring from the Creator stand in direct opposition to the collective worth and granting of rights by the state under communism. The attacks on the Church as being complicit in the Holocaust began in 1944 in the Soviet newspaper Izvestia, with an attack accusing the Pope of being an agent of Hitler. This attack was firmly denounced for its lack of credibility, even by the New York Times. And this line of attack fits the pattern of repeated lies over and over again. This is best illustrated by the play The Deputy, written by a far-left German communist named Rolf Hochhuth. The play depicted Pius XII as an anti-Semite who turned a blind eye to the Holocaust. It was soundly denounced by Holocaust survivors when it premiered in 1962, yet it was revived on Theatre Row in London in 2002 and made into a movie called Amen. Books like Hitler's Pope and Under His Very Window are just two of the many examples of follow-on books and articles accusing the Church of anti-Semitism and complicity in the Holocaust. Many of the accusations against Pius XII have been made despite his very public denunciations of Nazi doctrines and racism and his behind-the-scenes actions to protect the Jews. Many prominent Jews rose to defend Pius XII and the Church for protecting Jews during the war. Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, and Israeli Prime Ministers Moshe Sharett and Golda Meir all praised Pius XII's efforts and credited him and the Church in saving and protecting thousands of Jews. Israeli diplomat and historian Pedetius Lapida credited the Church, under the Pope's directions, with saving the lives of between 700,000 and 860,000 Jews during the Holocaust. The chief rabbi of Rome, Israel Zoli, who was hidden in the Vatican for more than a year, converted to Catholicism in 1945 and took Pius XII's baptismal name of Eugene Maria in honor of the Pope's effort to protect the Jews. Behind the scenes, the Pope helped to broker communications between German dissidents seeking to depose Hitler in the war and sue for peace with the Allies. This included German Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, pictured here before he was wounded and as portrayed by Tom Cruise, who attempted to assassinate Hitler in Operation Valkyrie. Von Stauffenberg communicated with British intelligence through the Church's diplomatic channels. Hitler was so angered by the Pope's actions that he planned to kidnap Pius XII and was only dissuaded from doing so by his propaganda chief, Goebbels. And all these actions by the Church and Pius XII took place all in the time frame of the Spanish Civil War, where over 6,000 Catholic clergy were murdered by the communists. This was while Stalin's terror was implemented in the Soviet Union against the Orthodox Church, and the Nazis were actively arresting Catholic clergy for deportation to their own death camps. Unfortunately, most people only know the title of the book, Hitler's Pope, when it comes to the actions of the Church during the war. The true measure of the perception of Poland in the war can be found in how they are reflected in public media from people who strive to be knowledgeable. It hit me like a ton of bricks in 2014 when Glenn Beck accused the Poles of doing nothing during the Holocaust on his national radio show. This was the primary motivator for me to try to place the story of Poland's contributions, its heroes, its betrayal, and its portrayal in popular media in a story format that could potentially penetrate and improve the popular perceptions of Poland during the war. Because the vast majority of people will never take the time to read the true history books, I decided to approach this endeavor in the historical novel format. It is my hope that by telling an entertaining but tragic story set into a historically accurate background, that I can inspire the readers to dig deeper into the real histories written by the real historians. Norman Davies' Trail of Hope was instrumental in setting this framework. No story of the Polish Second Corps can be told without its commander, General Anders. Originally commissioned in the Russian Imperial Army, he served in the Polish Army after Poland regained its independence. He was a brigadier general when Germany invaded in 1939, and he was wounded twice fighting both the German and Russian invading armies. He was arrested by the NKVD in the hospital, but instead of being sent to Smolensk, he was sent to Lubyanka prison in Moscow, where he was tortured for 18 months in an attempt to get him to join the Soviet Army. He was the only Polish general officer not executed at Katyn. Thinking back to the partition map from the discussion on Kosciuszko, the Polish Second Corps commander points out the age-old challenge to Polish independence in being surrounded by much larger and more aggressive neighbors. The map from his book shows Poland with its population of 35 million, sandwiched between Germany's 78.5 million and Russia's 175.5 million. These two maps give a good overview of the situation in Poland from 1939 to June 1941. The map on the left shows the invasion routes taken by the Germans and the Russians. The map on the right shows the agreed-upon political divide by Hitler and Stalin for the domination of Poland in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The area occupied by the Soviets includes all the area of Poland known as the Kresy. The area is also part of the Pale of Settlement, which extends from the north in Latvia and Lithuania, extending south to the Crimea in Ukraine, and is where Catherine the Great forced the settlement of Russian Jews she expelled from Moscow and St. Petersburg. This is where the story of the Polish Second Corps begins. The story takes place as an American Army officer, Brad Williamson, and his wife Kate meet Stan, a Polish Second Corps veteran, during a vacation trip to Italy. On the bus ride from Rome for a tour of Monte Cassino, they become acquainted with Stan, who is on his way to inter his wife's ashes at the military cemetery near the Abbey. Along the way, Stan tells the story of his arrest and the plight of his family in Poland during the war. I used the fictional characters of Stan and his family, his wife Gosia, and their friends Vlad and Piotrek to represent the hardships, suffering, and sacrifice of the Polish Second Corps, and to introduce the real-life heroes who characterized Poland's actions during the war. Stan's father and his older brother Jan, who followed his father's footsteps, were cavalry officers who at times in their careers served with Witold Pilecki and General Anders. Stan is the fictional cousin of my wife's real maternal grandmother, Bronislava Janchuk. Stan shares her family's very real hardships and losses from the Gulag deportations, as well as the Katyn and Volhynia massacres. In addition, Stan's brother, Tomasz, is a cadet who meets his end at Katyn. Stan's brother Adam is one of the many political prisoners in the Lvov jail murdered by the NKVD during its retreat from the German offensive of Operation Barbarossa. His sister Anya becomes a nurse after the death of their mother, and sees service with the Home Army in Warsaw. Her story introduces Irena Sendler, the Littlest Partisans, and Inka. Inka was a nurse and a courier of the Home Army who enlisted at the age of 15, participating in Home Army operations against the Nazis. She continued her service with the Home Army after the war, opposing Soviet occupation. She was arrested, tortured by the NKVD, and is said to have never broken under torture. She was executed by the Soviets shortly before her 18th birthday. The Littlest Partisans were the many children who, often orphaned, who served as couriers, medics, ammunition carriers, and even fought against the Nazis. Irena Sendler will be discussed later. Stan learns of Anya's fate 40 years after the war through the records of the National Institute of Remembrance, which is publishing much of the Polish historical records suppressed under Soviet rule. The Institute is also the source for Stan's knowledge of Brigadier General Zoe and the Olma family. Brigadier General Zoe Zawadzka was a courier who crossed the German frontier more than 100 times during the war, carrying messages to the government in exile. She was the only woman inducted into the most elite group 316, the Silent Unseen, and after one mission took her to London, she was parachuted back into Poland. The Olma family made the ultimate sacrifice protecting two Jewish families, and will be discussed in a moment. Stan also tells of his encounter with the most famous soldier of the Polish Second Corps, Wojtek the Soldier Bear, whose love of wrestling, beer, and cigarettes endeared him to the soldiers of the Second Corps. Stan and his friends Vlad and Piotrek are taught how to survive in the Gulag,
by an American named Victor Herman, who was imprisoned for refusing to renounce his American citizenship. He survived 40 years of Siberian exile before he returned to the United States. As the bus takes the traveling trio past the Pope's summer residence, Stan has the occasion to discuss the Church's actions during the war and introduces Maximilian Kolbe, who sacrificed himself for another prisoner at Auschwitz, and John Paul II, who was instrumental in ending Soviet rule. Stan also gives a spirited defense of Pius XII, who hid 3,000 Jews in the castle Gandolfo. Stan's brother Marek is a fictional member of Squadron 303, introducing the hero pilots Witold Urbanovich and Witold Tolo-Wukaszewski. Marek is also a fictional friend and university classmate of George Lenczowski, whom Stan becomes reacquainted with in Tehran. Stan's wife Gosia is a fictional friend of Bronislava Lenczowski. The Lenczowskis were real-life participants in the formation of the Polish Second Corps, as well as historical witnesses to Poland's betrayal at the Tehran Conference. The historical backdrop for all these stories began with the joint Nazi-Soviet invasion of Poland. The Second Corps story began with the deportation of 1.6 million Poles from eastern Poland to the Gulags of Siberia during the Soviet occupation from 1939 to 1941. The deportation of Poles began with a roundup and arrest by the NKVD. Stan explains the inroads of the NKVD into the areas of the Kresy and highlights the complexity of the relations between the ethnic Polish, Jewish, and Ukrainian peoples of eastern Poland. Stan explains, "The family I was arrested with were pointed out by locals. The most common inroads for the NKVD was through the local Jewish communities. Most of the Jews were not communist, but the NKVD targeted Jewish communities for recruitment to try to turn them. Because the Jews were often Russian speakers and had less of a sense of Polish nationality, they were natural targets for recruitment. The NKVD were masters of appealing to potential recruits from all angles. They would preach racial equality to those who felt discriminated against. They promised food for the hungry, power and prestige to those who wanted it, education for those who wanted to attend the university, revenge against the rich and to those who were poor. They capitalized on every desire and jealousy." General Anders addresses the issues of the NKVD recruited militias in his book, An Army in Exile, on pages 18 and 19. General Anders wrote, "The town council and all the leading personalities of Lvov had been arrested, including judges, lawyers, doctors, and Catholic priests. At this time, a number of Polish Jews, especially the young ones, who had made no secret of their joy at the entry of the Soviet troops, began to cooperate with the NKVD. A militia was formed from the riffraff of the town, who sought to curry favor with their new masters by denouncing all persons not friendly to the Soviet regime. My wife's grandfather, Pyotr Yanchuk, was arrested by one of these militias." This description is also confirmed by Leon Wells when he describes how his father was put in charge of the local food store and left in charge of the tenants of the apartment building he owned. He also notes how he and his sister were selected for university educations in Moscow, as well as his open ties with the NKVD after his release from the death camps. In addressing the use of Jewish militias by the Soviets, Stan outlines the Soviet strategy of driving wedges between these peoples by putting a public Jewish face on their crimes against the Poles and the Ukrainians, while accusing the Poles, as well as the Church, of being active participants in the Holocaust. Stan also notes the German program to implicate the Poles and Ukrainians, and how the accusations against the Poles were amplified by both Nazi and Soviet propaganda. The sources for this explanation of Soviet program are shown to the right. Of these books, only the Gulag Archipelago does not have a Jewish author. Many of these authors were seeking to find a better historical understanding of the prominent presence of Jews in the Soviet apparatus and to reconcile it with Russian anti-Semitism as expressed in Stalin's plans for the Doctor's plot and in Soviet policies in the post-Stalinist era. Stan explains, "The strategy was to divide and conquer. The communists exploited every cultural religious divide between the Jews and the Poles and the Ukrainians by making the Jews the public instrument of communism's crimes in repressing the Poles and Ukrainians. Once the perception was established, the Jews had nowhere else to turn for protection when the backlash came. They had no choice but to be loyal to the communists for protection, and the communists could then blame the Jews for all the atrocities of communism, and then dispose of them like any other enemy when they had served their purpose. They did all this at the same time they were labeling any Polish resistance to communist rule as anti-Semitic. My wife's maternal grandparents, Bronisława and Piotr Janczuk, are prime examples of the complexity of the ethnic situation in Poland and the hardships suffered by the peoples of eastern Poland. They suffered deportations to the Gulags, murders at Katyn, and survived the Volhynia massacre and ethnic cleansing. Piotr Janczuk was half Ukrainian and half Polish. He was baptized into the Orthodox faith. He spoke Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian. He was a school teacher near Kiev. As mentioned in an earlier slide, he was arrested by an NKVD Jewish militia. He was deported to the Gulags, where he spent 4 years. He had a beautiful handwriting, which was a valuable skill in the days before typewriters were common in Soviet Russia, and it helped him survive. The camp commandant, an uneducated Russian peasant, kept him alive to write his many reports to the NKVD hierarchy. His release from the Gulag was also impacted by another Jewish connection. Piotr's sister was married to a jeweler, and her Christian sister-in-law was married to a Jewish jeweler. The Jewish jeweler's brother was in prison with Piotr, and the Jewish jeweler bribed an NKVD general to order the release of Piotr and the jeweler's brother. After his release from the Gulag, Piotr was put on a train to return to Poland, and when he arrived at the Polish border, Piotr, together with the Jewish fellow he was released with, had to hide beneath the floorboards of the train to get across the border. When he returned to his home, he discovered his wife had been deported to Western Poland, and he had to walk all the way across Poland to find her. For her part, Bronisława suffered through the Soviet, then Nazi, then Soviet occupations. Her 2 brothers were military cadets and deported to the Gulags. One, Kazimierz, was murdered at Katyn along with most of the Polish officer corps. The other, Leon, was drafted into the Soviets' 1st Polish Division and was kept under Soviet command. He was killed fighting against the Germans at the Battle of Lenino in eastern Belarus. After her husband's arrest, Bronisława did not know if Piotr was alive or dead. Their second son, Pavel, was born after Piotr was taken. When the Volhynia massacres of the Polish people came to her area, Bronisława believed she would be killed. She begged a group of Poles fleeing in a horse-drawn wagon to take her then 3-year-old Jurek, who's on the right, with them, and they placed him under the seat of the wagon. Pavel, on the left, was breastfeeding infant at the time and could not survive without her. Outside of the village, the Poles in the wagon were ambushed, and everyone in the wagon except for Jurek was killed. The horses instinctively ran away from the firing and eventually returned to their barn, bringing Jurek and a wagon load of corpses with them. The trauma of the incident interrupted Jurek's natural speech development as a young child. When the Soviets took control of the area again, Bronisława was ethnically cleansed from her home village and forcibly moved from eastern Poland to pre-war German lands north of Wrocław, near the town of Głogów. Bronisława and Piotr's daughter, circled in red, is my mother-in-law, Elżbieta. Encountering the current popular perception of Poles as perpetrators of the Holocaust, Stan shares the stories of just a few of the heroes who risked, and who all too often gave their lives in opposing the persecution of the Jews. Among the more than 1,700 Poles recognized as righteous among nations by Yad Vashem is Irena Sendler. Irena Sendler was a Catholic social worker and nurse working in Warsaw. From the very start of the war, she began helping individual Jews with food and shelter. However, once the Warsaw Ghetto was established in 1940, she used her status as a social worker to enter the ghetto and began rescuing orphaned children from the ghetto. She later joined a group called Jagoda, a director of the government in exile dedicated to helping persecuted Jews. Her group smuggled nearly 2,500 babies and infants out of the Jewish ghetto and placed them with Polish families to save them. Jagoda used many methods, including smuggling the children out in suitcases, in ambulances when evacuating sick patients, and with false documents. Sendler even carried children in her bag through the German checkpoints. Fortunately, none of these children cried when she carried them through in the bags or suitcases, If she or any of the Jagoda health care workers had been caught smuggling the Jewish children, they would have been subject to immediate execution. Sindler kept the list of the names of the children in glass jars in her garden in the hope they could be reunited with families after the war. Unfortunately, the vast majority of the children's parents were exterminated at the Treblinka concentration camp. She compiled a list of all the children saved after the war, and the original list was transported to Israel from communist-ruled Poland by another former member of Jagoda, but was lost when he passed away. Sindler was eventually arrested and tortured by the Nazis when she was identified as a member of Jagoda. They broke her legs and feet in attempts to get information on other members, but they never found out about the babies she had rescued. They were saved and she survived the war, and she was rescued from the Gestapo custody when other members of Jagoda managed to bribe her executioner to fake her death. Later, the Soviets did their best to keep the story of her exploits a secret. Although Sindler was recognized by Yad Vashem as a righteous person in the 1960s, the Soviets labeled her a fascist. However, the true story of Sindler's bravery started to become more public in 1999 when a group of high school students in rural Kansas came across her obscured exploits. They began a historical project called Life in a Jar, the Irina Sindler Project. They wrote and performed a play in her honor and continued to promote her story of unique courage. The students were surprised to learn that she was still alive and living in Warsaw, and had the opportunity to meet Mrs. Sindler and honor her accomplishments. In 2003, she was awarded the Jan Karski Award for Courage and Service, and she has been recognized with postage stamps in both Poland and Israel. It is widely circulated that she was nominated for the Nobel Prize in 2007. However, the facts of her nomination will be kept secret by the Nobel Committee until 2057. And she died in 2008 at the age of 98. Another example is the Ulma family. In 1942, they and their 6 children gave shelter and hid 8 members of 2 Jewish families. Despite the threat of arrest and execution from occupying Nazi forces and their own financial hardships during the war, they gave safe harbor to those families for over 2 years. On March 24, 1944, their home was raided by Nazi gendarmes and blue policemen. The blue policemen were usually recruited from the Volksdeutsche, people of German descent living in Poland, or turncoats of Polish descent. After their hidden guests were executed, Josef, Victoria, and their 6 young children were executed. Victoria was 7 months pregnant with her 7th child, who was born as she was shot. In 1995, they were declared righteous among nations by Yad Vashem. And in 2010, they were honored with Commander's Cross of the Order Paulina Restituta by the Polish President Lech Kaczynski. In 2003, they were nominated for sainthood. The entire family was beatified on September 10th of 2023 and await canonization. Stan also introduces 2 great heroes for spreading the news of the Holocaust, Jan Karski and Witold Pilecki. Jan Karski trained to be an artillery officer in the Polish army, but had the ultimate goal of becoming a diplomat. In the early stages of the war, his unit was bypassed by the German army penetrating deeper into Poland. After 2 weeks of walking, his unit was met by Soviet forces, and his commanders agreed to disarm the unit, after which all the personnel were taken prisoner at gunpoint and transported to Russia. During one of the many prisoner exchanges between the Germans and the Russians, Karski escaped by having himself thrown from a small window on the moving train. He joined the underground and became a courier. During one of his missions to France in 1940, he was arrested by the Gestapo in Slovakia. While undergoing torture, several of his teeth were broken or knocked out, and fearing he would break under torture and provide information endangering others, he attempted suicide by slashing his wrists. Wanting to keep him alive for further torture, the Germans put him in the hospital, where the Polish underground was able to rescue him. Following his recovery, he conducted a personal survey of the Warsaw Jewish ghetto and posed as a Ukrainian guard at a transfer station for the Belzec concentration camp. Karski carried his own along with Witold's Witold Pilecki's report, and other reports documenting the mass extermination of the Jews in Nazi concentration camps out of Poland to the Western Allies. His movement required a train trip from Poland across Nazi Germany through occupied France and crossing into Spain on a bicycle before catching a boat with an open water transfer to reach England. Given the high profile of Karski's mission to the Western Allies, he was unable to resume any secret missions back to Nazi or Soviet-occupied Poland. He spent much of 1944 warning the West about Soviet oppression and what would befall Poland if allowed to continue. Soviet propaganda responded to these warnings by calling Karski an anti-Semite. Witold Pilecki is one of World War II's greatest heroes. He had a long career of service in Poland. He served in the First World War and in the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1920. He returned to active service when Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. With the collapse of the Polish front, Pilecki went underground and joined the Polish Home Army. He is the only known person to have voluntarily allowed himself to be captured for incarceration in the Auschwitz concentration camp. He volunteered to be arrested under the false identity of Tomasz Serafiński in a general street roundup by the Gestapo. While in Auschwitz, he organized a resistance group within the work section of the camp, smuggled out information and proof of the Nazi implementation of the industrial extermination program at Auschwitz, better known as Witold's report, and set in place plans for a mass escape from the camp if an attack or bombing raid could be carried out by the Allied forces. During his mission in Auschwitz, he survived a bout of the flu while enduring the punishing work schedule necessary to avoid execution. His report was carried out of Poland by Jan Karski and alerted the world to the mass extermination of the Jews in the Nazi concentration camps. After nearly 3 years in the camp, Pilecki escaped with 2 other prisoners. He was wounded while moving from Auschwitz to Warsaw. He fought in the Warsaw Uprising in August and September of 1944. He was recognized for his bravery and valor in the capture of several buildings during the street-to-street fighting, as well as for the rescue of wounded and removal of the dead from the line of fire. He was taken prisoner at the conclusion of the uprising and spent the rest of the war in a German prisoner of war camp and was liberated by Patton's Third Army in April 1945. Joining the Polish Second Corps in Italy, Pilecki presented General Anders with a plan to gather information on Soviet persecution of the Home Army. Anders approved, and Pilecki returned to Poland in 1945 to begin his work. He was arrested in May 1947 by the Polish secret police, the Bezpieczeństwa, and subjected to horrific tortures during his interrogations. He told his family the treatment was worse than any he received in Auschwitz. And on May 15, 1948, he was given 3 death sentences following a show trial in which he was not allowed to testify nor present witnesses on his own behalf. He was executed in Mokotów prison in Warsaw on May 25, 1948, and his body has yet to be recovered. The events of Pilecki's arrest, torture, and execution demonstrate the complexity of the Soviet hand in driving a wedge between Jews and Poles. Pilecki's interrogator and torturer, the supervisor of his interrogation, and the prosecutor judge who issued him 3 death sentences were all Jewish. Rosenstiel and Romkowski were longtime members of the Communist Party in Poland before the war. The younger Wolenska Bruce joined the party during the war. All 3 joined the Urząd Bezpieczeństwa, or the UB, the Polish subsidiary of the NKVD, during the Soviet occupation. All 3 were later purged in 1956 at the end of the Stalinist era. Rosenstiel and Romkowski were both sentenced to 15 years for torturing detainees and were eventually given early release, and each died in Poland. Wolenska Bruce was dismissed from her position as a prosecutor and judge, and she and her communist husband immigrated to the UK, where he became a professor at Oxford University, and she died in the UK in 2008. After the fall of communism in Poland, Pilecki's actions during the war began to be publicly recognized. In 1990, he was finally exonerated of the charges for which he was executed, and in 1996 was awarded the Order of Polina Restituta, and in 2006 was awarded Poland's highest decoration, Order of the White Eagle. On September 5, 2013, he was posthumously promoted to Colonel of the Polish Army. Sadly, Pulaski's treatment was not unique. It was all too common for the soldiers of the Home Army who were systematically arrested, tortured, imprisoned, and murdered by the UB from 1945 to 1962. They were frequently accused of Nazi collaboration. Getting back to the story of the Polish Second Corps, Hitler beat Stalin to the punch as they prepared to turn on each other in June of 1941 by launching Operation Barbarossa. As the Wehrmacht penetrated deeply into Russia, Stalin had a need to throw all the bodies he could into the fight. So instead of starving the Poles to death in the Gulags, why not throw them at the Germans? And so began the process of gathering Poles from the far reaches of the Gulag system in the fall and winter of 1941-42 to build a Polish army to fight the Germans. As the Germans advanced east and threatened to push past Stalingrad and to move on the oil fields of Iran in 1942, the Anders Army was moved to Yangi-Ul in Uzbekistan. Churchill convinced Stalin to release the Poles to the British command to protect Iran and safeguard a southern land route for the Lend-Lease supplies to the Soviet Union, which were being decimated on the northern sea routes by Germans operating from bases in Norway. And so began the trek of the Anders Army on the Trail of Hope into Iran and the introduction of two of the central real-life historical figures in the novel, George and Bronislawa Lenczowski. They are the parents of John Lenczowski, IWP's founder. They were eyewitnesses to most of the major events which befell Poland during the war, including the humanitarian crisis that accompanied the Anders Army out of Russia and the ultimate betrayal of Poland at the negotiating table in Iran. Born in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1915, George Jerzy Lenczowski descended from a long line of Polish nobility. His family narrowly escaped Russia following the Bolshevik Revolution and settled in newly independent Poland, where Jerzy began his education. He originally wanted to be a soldier, but was disqualified by his poor eyesight. He pursued academic endeavors, earning a civil law degree, followed by a doctorate in France in 1937. He joined the Polish Diplomatic Corps, serving an apprenticeship in British Palestine, where he worked on issues for Jews immigrating from Poland to the Holy Land. He returned to Warsaw to take his final diplomatic exams to become a fully credentialed diplomat. His exams were scheduled for September 1st, 1939, and were interrupted by the German invasion and the bombing of the city. He evacuated from Poland across the Czechoslovakian border with the foreign ministry staff, but soon after crossing the border, any sense of order was lost to the chaos of the waves of fleeing refugees. Jerzy eventually joined the Carpathian Brigade, which was formed from British expatriates in the Balkans, and served under British command. He served with the brigade at Tobruk, where the brigade was instrumental in blocking the advance of Rommel's Africa Corps towards Egypt, and during the battle he had several close calls from the German bombing raids. After the first battle of Tobruk, he was selected for officer training in Egypt and then Gaza. After he was commissioned, he was promoted to the rank of second lieutenant and was appointed as an assistant intelligence officer in the 1st Brigade of the Carpathian Division of the Polish Corps. And the brigade was moved to northern Iraq to help thwart a potential German attack from advanced positions in the Caucasus regions. In October 1942, the Deputy Prime Minister for the government in exile visited the Carpathian Brigade, and he recognized Jerzy by name. After a brief debate between the Deputy Prime Minister and the Commanding General of the division as to where his intellectual skills were most needed, it was determined that Second Lieutenant Lenczowski would be recalled to the Diplomatic Corps and posted to the Polish legation in Tehran. When he arrived in Tehran, Jerzy was appointed as the press attaché, and using the full spectrum of his intellect and language skills to promote Polish interest among the Allied international community. He was an eyewitness to the historic meeting of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin at the Tehran Conference, November 28th to December 1st in 1943. And during his service for Poland and Africa and Iran, both of Jerzy's parents were deported to concentration camps in Germany, where they were executed. Following the Yalta Conference of 1945, which cemented the Tehran Agreement, Jerzy and Bronia refused to work for the Soviet-installed government in Poland and sought refuge in the United States. Jerzy pursued a career in higher education and after a brief stint as an assistant professor at Hamilton College in New York, while also assisting the U.S. State Department in its International Broadcasting Division, he accepted a teaching post at the University of California, Berkeley, where he became a tenured professor and founded the first Middle Eastern Studies program in the U.S. Professor Andrew Janos of the UC Berkeley wrote of Jerzy in his memorial tribute. In his scholarship, he was aided by the mastery of a great number of languages: Polish, English, French, German, Russian, Arabic, and Farsi. He was a master interviewer who could develop unusual rapport with his subjects and, with his reputation for objectivity, would be as welcome by royalty in Muslim countries as by the academic community and political leaders of the new state of Israel. The same personal qualities earned him the respect of U.S. administrations of both political parties and made him a frequent visitor to the White House under both Democrat and Republican administrations. Among the former prisoners residing in Tehran when Jerzy arrived was an elegant and refined teacher and social worker named Bronisława Szylkiewicz. She reminded Jerzy of Ingrid Bergman. Ms. Szylkiewicz was arrested during the Soviet occupation at the beginning of the war for counter-revolutionary activities during her studies at the Warsaw Free University. When she was taken into custody for questioning in late September 1939, she wisely wore her heaviest coat and boots, and she was immediately deported to Russia and incarcerated in Gorky prison for 27.5 months. She was never formally charged, and her trial was repeatedly delayed for further investigation. When the call for the Anders Army went out, she was released from Gorky prison, and Bronia found her way to the Polish embassy in Kubyshev. After an interview with Ambassador Kot, who was later the Prime Minister, she was appointed to the embassy staff to help with the refugee processing. However, she spent most of the following months recovering from a severe illness resulting from her imprisonment. As she was under threat of rearrest if she left the embassy, she spent her entire illness and recovery on a cot in the hallway of the embassy. She had to be smuggled out of Russia with the embassy staff because the Soviets would not grant her an exit visa. And when she arrived in Tehran, Bronia continued the work she started in Kubyshev. Although she was only in her mid-20s, she was appointed Director of Refugee Affairs in Tehran, overseeing the program to organize, feed, clothe, house, and resettle between 70,000 and 100,000 women and children who were released from the Gulags, along with the men who were intended to form the Polish army. In their books, both General Anders and Norman Davies document the humanitarian crisis which characterized the state of the Anders Soviet, or all the Poles released from the Gulags with the Anders Army. The pictures in this slide give visual context to the depth of the problems which Bronia Glinchowski faced in her role as Director of Refugee Affairs for Poland and Iran. These pictures show the equally bad condition of the army when it arrived at the Iranian port of Pavli. In the novel, Stan describes the horrific conditions endured by the soldiers on the ship, noting the lack of room to sit, the unbearable stench from buckets for toilets as many were suffering from dysentery. As you can see on the map, the crosses marked in Iran are cemeteries where the Poles who died following their release from the Gulags are buried. The first stop for the arriving soldiers was delousing and a new uniform issue. The women of the Anders Soviet rose to the occasion. Many joined the Auxiliary Women's Service, or PSK, filling many roles in medical, administrative, intelligence, and logistics services. They were instrumental in coping with humanitarian crises and provided vital services to supporting the army. In the novel, the history of the PSK provides the background for the service of Stan's bride Gosha and her presence in Iran and in accompanying the Anders Army to Italy. The history of the Polish Corps' movements, training, and social activities from the Gulags to Iran, across the Middle East, and on to Italy provide the perfect backdrop for the story of Stan's struggle to free his homeland and his courtship with Gosha. Along the way, the discipline and training of the Second Corps greatly impressed at least one notable American general. George Patton was highly impressed with General Anders' development and training of the Corps into a fighting force. Patton once wrote of the perfect discipline he observed when inspecting a Polish soldier. When a fly crawled on the face near the eye of the soldier as he stood at attention, the soldier would not even allow himself to blink. Of course, I had to incorporate it into the story. Stan tells the story of the battle over the course of 2 days as he tours the city of Cassino, the Abbey, and the battle area with Kate and Brad. He starts from the macro level and then gets closer to his and his friend's personal battle as his time with Brad and Kate progresses. And during a tour of the Historical Museum, Stan recounts the early stages of the battle, including the American attempts to force a crossing of the Rapido River in January 1944, where the 141st and the 143rd Infantry Regiments suffered over 2,000 casualties. It was the single greatest loss for the Americans on the Western Front outside of Omaha Beach on D-Day. He also notes the crossing of the Rapido River north of Cassino 3 weeks later. During the tour of the Historical Museum, there is a discussion of the controversial bombing of the Abbey, which occurred on February 15, 1944. More than 1,150 tons of bombs were dropped by 225 Allied bombers, reducing the historic Abbey to rubble. On the second day, as they overlooked the Polish cemetery from the windows of the Abbey's museum, Stan recounts the second phase of the battle and the attacks by the famed Nepalese Gurkha mountain fighters from the 4th Indian Division, who attacked in and around the Abbey but were beaten back. Stan also references back to the Maori Battalion's fight in the train station, which he had discussed with Brad and Kate while having lunch the day prior. Continuing the discussion as they look down on Stan's battlefield circled in blue, Stan transitions to tell the story of the Polish Second Corps fight from just after midnight on the 12th to their withdrawal on the 13th, to their second attack and victory on the 18th. And as he stands next to Stan, viewing the low ground where Stan's unit, the 12th Lancers, advanced during the battle from the perspective of a professional infantry officer, Brad thinks back to the lines of Tennyson's charge of the Light Brigade. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon to the front of them volleyed and thundered. Stormed out with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. Through Brad, I try to recount my own impressions of the terrain on which the Second Corps fought. These pictures depict the difficulty of appreciating the lay of the land from a topographical map. The picture on the right is taken looking up at the Abbey from where the red arrow is pointing to on the map. It is only by seeing the terrain that one can truly begin to appreciate and assess its steepness. The summit on which the Abbey sits is one of the 2 major hills the Corps had to fight their way up. After Gosha's internment, Stan tells the story of his and his friends' personal battles on the slopes below the Abbey and the cemetery. And when it comes to telling the story of the actual attacks by the Polish Second Corps, the difficulty was summed up by General Anders himself. General Anders wrote, "Our soldiers, frequently diving to take cover from fire, even had difficulty keeping in constant contact with each other. Officer after officer was killed, and his place taken by the next in seniority. It accordingly is not easy to describe an action made up of experiences of individual detachments, sections, or even single soldiers. It was a collection of small epics, many of which can never be told, for their heroes took to their graves the secrets of their exploits. The Polish soldiers' dauntless will and self-sacrifice were the key to a battle in which each man had perforce to play a lonely but heroic role. Each minute brought dreadful experiences, and the sum of them was victory." This was part of the reason why General Anders and Private Wojciech Kowalski are the only real-life members of the Polish Second Corps who fought at Monte Cassino, specifically mentioned by name in the novel. In representing the triumph and tragedy of the soldiers of the Second Corps during the battle, I found it easier to tell the stories of so many acts of bravery, courage, and sacrifice through the fictional characters of Stan, Gosha, Vlad, and Piotr. The picture on this slide depicts the difficulty of hauling the heavy ammunition boxes up the mountainsides. These pictures from Melcher Vankovich's book show the difficulty of simply trying to take a step in the terrain. Any movement forward required a climb. As shown in the pictures on the top right, the sharp rocks would shatter and fragment when struck by incoming bullets, and throwing a grenade had the risk of it rolling back down on the thrower. The enemy bunkers, which were so easily hidden in the terrain, had to be rooted out by the soldiers of the Second Corps. Belcher Vankovich's photos also documented the defoliated trees around the Abbey and the stark terrain of the Abbey's grounds. Casualty evacuation was equally difficult, if not impossible. Soldiers often died where they fell because no one could get to them during the first golden hour after they were wounded. Once they were found, it was a difficult trip to the aid station. This slide features the Domek Doctora, or doctor's house, which was the first place wounded soldiers of the Carpathian Division were seen by a medical doctor. During the 48-hour period of May 17th and 18th, Dr. Vavrizhnek and his team treated over 500 casualties with a 98% survival rate. Once they were treated at the doctor's house, the wounded had to endure a bumpy ride down the mountain to the division hospital for further treatment. Once at the division hospital, there was opportunity for surgery and further recovery. The casualty evacuation and treatment process is incorporated into the novel and provides a backdrop for Stan and Grosch's story. The picture on the left shows the Abbey as it appeared during my visit to Monte Cassino. It was taken from just outside the entrance to the Polish military cemetery, in the approximate location of the red circle in the picture on the right. One can see the contrast between the regrown foliage and the barren terrain the soldiers of the Second Corps faced as they attacked up the valley between the Abbey and Hill 593. And while their phenomenal bravery and fighting skill carried them through to victory on these slopes, they could not stop the betrayal of their efforts to regain their homeland at the negotiating tables in Tehran, Yalta, and finally Potsdam. This is where Jerzy Linchowski's witness of the events in Tehran come into play for Stan and his friends. In his memoirs, the senior Dr. Linchowski was astounded at the naivete of Roosevelt in dealing with Stalin. Churchill was also upset at how easily Stalin seemed to manipulate FDR. Churchill had wanted to have some separate conference time with FDR in Tehran, both in Tehran and afterwards. But Roosevelt declined Churchill's offer because he felt Stalin might feel and that he and Churchill were conspiring against him. Meanwhile, Stalin had several long meetings with FDR and cut Churchill out of several negotiations. But Churchill also seemed to lose sight of some critical issues in his own opinions on the negotiations. Stan explains, I later read Churchill's account of the Tehran conference. It coincided with everything Jerzy told us after the war. Even after my time in the Gulags, it still amazed me how cold, callous, and calculated Stalin was throughout the negotiations. After it was discovered that the Soviets had murdered over 15,000 Polish officers and cadets, including my brother Tomasz, Stalin broke diplomatic ties with the Polish government in exile in London over the publication of the details surrounding the Katyn massacre. At the conference, Stalin lamented how we Poles were joining Hitler in slanderous propaganda against the Soviet Union when he was personally responsible for the murder of those men, including my brother Tomasz. He accused the Poles of siding with the Germans and promoting anti-Soviet propaganda. Churchill seemed to lose sight of the fact that the Russians had actually invaded Poland in cooperation with the Nazis. It was so maddening to read that when negotiating where Poland's border should be drawn in the east and west, Churchill believed that Poland owed a debt of gratitude to the Soviets for their fight against the Nazis. This gets to the heart of the betrayal of Poland. The entire Kresy, the area in gray, where almost all the soldiers of the Polish Second Corps were from, was permanently cut off from Poland and given wholesale to Stalin. After all they had sacrificed to regain their homeland, their families, and their freedom, everything the soldiers of the Polish Second Corps were fighting for was traded away at the negotiating table after they had sacrificed so much to get back to their homes. As Stan recounts, looking down on the cemetery, this place is not just a piece of ground that armies fought over. It was the intersection of our Polish history where the politics of nation impacted and defined the lives and deaths of so many of us who fought here. It was the culmination of many forces of love, politics, human nature. This piece of Italian soil is not just where my comrades achieved their greatest triumph of the war, it also defines all that is the tragedy of Poland in the war. Every man in those graves down there gave his all to free his homeland and help defeat the Nazis. For many of us, it was the only thing we had to live for. Unfortunately, we were betrayed, and all that we had to live for was traded to the psychopath who helped Hitler in his invasion of our homeland, taking our homes, our land, killing our families. It's something that very few living people would know of, with the exception of those who are willing to make the extra effort to learn about it. Those of us who know of it will be joining our comrades in the cemetery very soon. I don't want their stories to die with us. And in looking at all the soldiers of the Second Corps lost, it is a wonder that the suicide rate of the Polish Second Corps was not far higher. It is only in the context of this history that one can begin to grasp the depths of the tragedy in the lines engraved on the obelisk on the peak of Hill 593 above the Polish cemetery at Monte Cassino. We Polish soldiers, for your freedom and ours, have given our souls to God, our bodies to the soil of Italy, and our hearts to Poland. Thank you very much. I hope you will take away a deeper appreciation of the sacrifices of America's oldest and most loyal ally.